أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to the podcast of the Shia Research Institute in Toronto. It's a pleasure indeed to welcome and present Dr. Sayyid Nizamuddin Ahmad to this program today. Dr. Nizamuddin Ahmad currently holds the position of the Prophet Muhammad Visiting Professor of Shia Islamic Studies at Florida International University in the US. Dr. Sahab, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you for accepting our invitation for this podcast and conversation, inshallah. Can I begin by asking you to describe a little bit about your intellectual journey, especially when I look at your biography, your move from pure mathematics to philosophy and Islamic studies, that shift is something of interest to know.
Well, first of all, it's a distinct honor and privilege to be here with you on this podcast and to see you again after such a long time, almost a year, I think. Yes, my own intellectual journey. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa amma bi ni'mati rabbika fahaddith. So I guess you're kind of asking me about how I went from mathematics to...
Yeah, it's basically towards Islamic studies in that sense.
I was always interested in learning. I was, as a child of a very, very curious temperament. I was interested in all sorts of things. And my initial fascination was with the order of nature, with really what is the world of the natural sciences. But I was very young. And I was also interested in other things as well. And so my interests were always very broad, is what I mean to say, from a very early age. And in high school, I was mainly interested in the sciences, physics, chemistry, mathematics. But I also very much enjoyed history. I had a world history class. We also had a US history class. These were required subjects.
Where was this?
This was in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It was a high school called Ben Davis High School in Indianapolis, a long time ago. Anyhow, so I thought that, I wanted to be able to pursue other interests as well. But and like many South Asian parents, my father had suggested maybe I should go into medicine. I could have, but I really didn't. I found the subject interesting enough, but I don't really like dealing with patients and this kind of thing. I don't think I would have been very good at that. So I thought, let me just go for engineering. That's a sort of a practical subject. And I had this idea in my head that, there would be enough money so that I could pursue my other interests as well. And so I ended up going to Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. And I was in engineering. And after a few years in that, I didn't quite like it. I didn't like the labs. I liked the more theoretical aspects. I didn't really like the collecting the data and the sorts of things you do in lab, right? And at the same time, I was taking different humanities classes, and I was getting more and more interested in deeper questions. And when I was in high school, there was a time that I spent in Saudi Arabia. Because my father, marhum, was a sociologist. Okay. And he was educated in the US, but he ended up accepting a position at Jamiat al-Malik Abdul Aziz, or King Abdul Aziz University in Jeddah. Mm-hmm. And so I went there for a couple of years when I was actually of high school age. And so while I was there, I picked up a lot of spoken Arabic. And I understood the system because we had to take 6 hours of Arabic in school, but it wasn't well taught. It was just an Egyptian guy, he didn't know any English, and he just would say things, and you had to sort of Yeah. But as a result of that, my Arabic penmanship became very good. We had to copy things, and I understood the verb system. So I knew, and my father had an excellent library, and so we had a copy of the Hanswehr dictionary of Arabic to English, and so I was able to look up words and so forth. And so that stayed with me. So when I finally ended up at university, I was becoming interested in reading different books from the Islamic intellectual tradition, which had been translated into English. And some of them were actually translated from Persian into English. So one of the books which I came across early in my time in university, in between engineering and science classes, was the Metaphysica of Avicenna, translated by Parviz Moravij. And that was a Persian text from the Ilahiyat from the Danishnameh Ala'i of Ibn Sina, and I found it to be a very interesting book. And around that same time, I encountered another couple of books. One of them was the Fusus al-Hikam by Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, which I later went on to do some work on. And another book which I encountered in translation was the Kitab al-Hikam of Ibn Ata'illah al-Sikandari, who was a Shadili Sufi wali from Alexandria in the line of Abul Hasan Shadili. So he studied with Abul Abbas al-Mursi. Abul Abbas al-Mursi studied with Abul Hasan al-Shadili, the eponymous founder, so to speak, of the Shadili Tariqa. So I became interested in really going into the original languages. And when I read the opening lines of the Fusus al-Hikam, I was wondering, what is the original Arabic here? I mean, does it say, what word is used for God? Does he use the word Allah? Does he use Rabb? Does he use Haqq? Because I had some understanding. So in those days, this is before the internet. There was an internet. I had email because I was an engineering student, but nobody else knew what email was, if you can imagine, in those days. But there was no World Wide Web. So I thought I must get this book, the Fusus al-Hikam. And we had something in those days called interlibrary loan. So I ordered the book through ILL, interlibrary loan. It came from the University of Washington. And I had it for 2 weeks, and I went and I photocopied the whole thing. And then I started reading it, not really knowing any sarf, nahw, anything, just trying to figure out what was there and comparing with English, and I was really fascinated. So I changed my specialization or my major to mathematics, which suited me much more than no labs and all of that. And then I took a bunch of courses in religion and so forth, and I decided I was going to study Arabic. So I finished my Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics at Purdue University. And then I went after that to Indiana University, Bloomington, the rival school, which was more humanities. Purdue, people in America, they know. I mean, maybe in Canada, they don't know so much about it. Purdue is more of a technical place, polytechnic kind of thing. And IU, or Indiana University, Bloomington, was more humanities. Anyway, so I ended up there, and I did an MA in Arabic. And part of that was the possibility to study abroad for a year in a program called CASA, the Center for Arabic Study Abroad, which at the time was administered through Johns Hopkins University in partnership with the American University of Cairo. So then I went to Cairo for a year, and there my Arabic became very good. And I also unofficially, officially but not informing the American University, enrolled in classes at Al-Azhar.
Oh, okay.
And
they allowed you to do that?
Let's just say I got away with it. They didn't know. I mean, we weren't allowed to do it, but I did. And
no, Miss Al-Azhar accepted it.
Yes.
Yeah,
they did. So I got into classes there, and that program at AUC, or American University in Cairo, was for a year. But I was having so much fun, I didn't want to go back. So I went back, I did my MA exams, got my MA, and I just got on a plane and came back. And I stayed in Egypt for another year, just sort of hanging out, as they say in America, enjoying my time. And after that, I started just taking, I maintained my registration at Azhar, but I stopped going to the classes. And I started studying privately with people. So I was interested in learning, things. And I wasn't too, particular. And so I thought, let me learn something very unusual, which I didn't know about. So I enrolled in classes in Maliki law, which was very weird compared to what background I had come to. So I had classes in Maliki law. I had classes in the Alfiya ibn Malik. I found a Sufi guy who was teaching the Hikam of Ibn Ata'illah, which I had heard about. And then I started building my Arabic library and collecting books. And so it was a fantastic time. I just didn't do anything except study and read and, eat kebabs and things like that. Just enjoyed my time. So after that, after another year, my mother wrote me a letter. This is those days. And she was saying, look, it's time you came back. And I really wasn't interested in coming back. And she had taken a few pages from the catalog in those days of Princeton University, from the Near Eastern Studies Department, had tore out the pages and put them in an envelope with her letter and sent it to me and said, you should look at this university and there's someone there you might want to study with.
Oh.
So that was Mudarrisi.
Okay.
So when I was at...
How did she know about Mudarrisi?
I'll tell you.
Okay.
So my family had come back from Saudi Arabia. After I had started university, at some point they came back. I don't remember the exact time. And so they also lived. We all lived in West Lafayette, Indiana. We had a house there. I didn't live in the dorms when I was studying at Purdue. Yeah. So I found a book at a bookstore called The Mantle of the Prophet by Roy Mutahida.
Yeah.
And as you know, that book is really more or less based on the life of Mudarrisi. It's really, it's a book which is supposed to be on the history of education in Iran, but he tells it through these fictional vignettes through the eyes of someone he calls Ali Hashimi, which is the fictionalized version of Hussein Mudarrisi. And it was known, and that book came out in New York, Simon Schuster, 1986. I have the original edition, hardcover with dust jacket. And then many years later when I met Roy, I had him autograph the book. But I had heard that the person that this book was based on, it was at Princeton, and since my parents were there and they knew I was reading this book, my mother knew I had read that book. So she had also found out, so she said, maybe you'd be interested in going and studying there. So to make a long story short, I ended up coming back, I got into Princeton, and then I went there and got my PhD in Islamic Studies.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in Islamic Studies, when you did your PhD, what was the theme?
Well, when I first arrived at Princeton, I wanted to work on Ibn Arabi. Well, as you know, things change. Things can change. And so then I got very interested in Islamic law, usul al-fiqh, and I originally had a topic.
That's the area of Dr. Mudarrisi.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's what I was originally thinking of doing, and I was looking actually in those days at the Rasail of Sheikh Murtada Ansari.
Oh.
Yes. And everybody calls it the Rasail, but it's actually Fara'id al-Usul.
Fara'id al-Usul.
And I was really interested in that book, and so I was reading that a lot, and I was looking at commentaries, and I thought I was going to write something on this. But in the end, I changed my topic, and I ended up writing on fatwas. Okay. Fatwas of condemnation, and the book was published later in Kuala Lumpur. So I took fatwas as a source of intellectual and social history, and I looked at a number of fatwas, which I called fatwas of condemnation, fatwas which were issued in condemnation of people, groups, ideas, and doctrines throughout history that the issuing mufti found to be problematic for one reason or another. And so I look at a number of issues in that book, like the Mawlid or the Milad celebration of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Many Sunni jurists, some Sunni groups think of this as a bid'ah. So what's the background there? So I took a fatwa from Muslim Spain about that topic and analyzed it. And then there was and I gave the whole background. And there were others. There were fatwas given against the Shia. That's an interesting chapter, if I may say so.
It's still going on, yeah.
And it's still going on, yeah. But then there was the most famous fatwa in that book anyway that I dealt with was the fatwa of Ayatollah Sayyid Ruhollah al-Khomeini against the author of the Satanic Verses. Yeah. So.
Okay, that's maybe briefly about your stay in Cairo and Malaysia as a teaching there.
Right. Well, after I finished my PhD from Princeton in 2000, and yes, then I worked briefly. Actually, leading up to it, also I worked briefly. I worked briefly in UT Austin, and I also worked briefly very briefly at the Imam Ali seminary in the earliest incarnation in the days of Maulana Amir Mukhtar Faizi.
Oh, okay.
That was quite some time back.
Yeah.
And then, but when I finished, and then I had taught at UT Austin when I was finishing my dissertation. So when I finally defended, I ended up leaving the country. I got a job, but it was later. It was January 2001. So I got a job in Malaysia at the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization in Kuala Lumpur. So I moved there in January and started work on February, 1st of February. And I was there for about 3 years. And it was a nice job. It was a graduate kind of institute. There were no undergraduates. So it was a nice job to have as your first job coming out of a PhD. And I only taught graduate seminars, and it was quite nice, and I had time for research, and I wrote some nice papers back then. But the honest truth is, Maulana, by that time I was so fed up with Islamic studies, because when I was at Princeton, I took a long time to finish. I took 8 years. The library was so marvelous, so I spent a lot of time there just reading and doing whatever I found interesting. And I had a full scholarship to Princeton. So I took classes in philosophy, I learned Syriac, I took classes in Hebrew, I took some math classes. I was just enjoying myself. So it took me a long time to finish, but then I obviously towards the end I had to focus on Islamic studies. So I was reading just Islamic sources all the time for hours and hours and hours a day. And so by the time I got out and I was in Malaysia, I really wasn't, I taught my classes, but in my spare time I was just doing other things. I was very interested in Japan. I was reading Japanese, novels, and I was in translation, and I was reading about Buddhist philosophy, and I was learning kendo, and I was involved in karate, and doing all these sorts of things. And around that time, there was a very nice conference that took place in Iran. Excuse me. And so I went to that conference. I'd always wanted to go to Iran. I'd never been able to go with a U.S. passport. And so we had this invitation. It was an international conference. It was in the days of Khatami and Larijani, when they were having the whole idea of dialogue between civilizations, Guftugu Tamadun Ha, as they called it in Persian. And so it was easy to go. And my institute had a good relation, and so they invited most of the professors at ISTAC, as it was called. And there was a conference it was called Cordoba and Isfahan, two schools of Islamic philosophy. And Mahdi Muhaqqiq at that time, who was at the Anjuman Asaru Farhang Milli, I think it's called. Anjuman Asaru Mafakhir Milli, excuse me, was one of the organizers of that. So I got to go to Iran. I stayed there for about 6 weeks. After the conference, I collected a lot of books. That's where I first, in person, met my very good friend, Sayyid Rizvi. And we traveled all over Iran. It was quite fun. And we bought lots of books. And then I came back. And so after about 3 years at ISTAC, decided to leave. I was very much wanted to be in the Arab world. And so then I got a job at the American University of Sharjah in the UAE. So then I ended up there. I was there for about 5 years. Then in the summer of 2008, that's when I went to AUC, American University in Cairo. So a position had come up, I applied, and I went there. And by that time I had 4 children. And we moved to Cairo in around 2008, and that was sort of my dream job. I always wanted to go back to Cairo and live there, and I got a lot of work done there. That's where I worked on the Fusus, my critical edition.
Yeah. Maybe if we can now move on to your interest in Tajrid al-Iʿtiqād and the translation that you had done. Your interest in this book, how was it initiated? Because I think it's important for the viewers also to realize that when it comes to the study of theology or i'tiqādat as such, Um, the Shi'i perspective has this, three different methods we talk about. One is on the level of aql,
Yeah.
and his, and then qalb. Whether you're talking about using science as a window of understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on a hissi, level, or you're going to the intellectual, philosophical way. Or finally, when they talk about qalb, whether we call it irfan or mysticism. Of course, not everybody has the interest in all different levels, but I think the emphasis of the aqli method, rational method by the Shia theologians from very beginning is kind of a hallmark of the Shia Islam.
Yes. And
we see that, more pronounced in the early days from Sheikh Mufid onwards. Even I would say, Sheikh Saduq was a muhaddis, but if you look at Kitab al-Tawheed, for example, the ahadith he brings up are actually, the arguments are mostly aqli.
Yeah.
It doesn't say that the Imam said that, Quran has said, so you must believe there is God. So even the ahadith are, or if you look at Kitab al-Tawheed of even al-Kafi, has the same approach. And so it will be interesting to see how, in Shia Islam, especially when it comes to the work of Khwaja Nasruddin Tusi, its importance in the Shi'i circles.
Yes, this is really, you've asked a lot there's a lot of issues there. All right, so my own interest in the Tajrīd is how you started. So let's begin there.
Yeah.
Well, my entire interest in Islamic studies came essentially from the point of view of these three related subjects: falsafa, philosophy, ilm al-kalam, or so-called theology, and tasawwuf, Sufism or irfan. And those are the kinds of things I first started that really attracted my interest. And the fundamental question there is the nature of the ultimate reality, ultimate truth, the nature of existence, of being, of wujud. And that is directly addressed by Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. So I'm coming at your question on the Tajrīd, just please bear with me.
Yeah.
And so I was very interested in this whole question of wujud, wahdatul wujud. And you also find that in metaphysics, especially as it developed in Islam, not so much, it's heavily indebted to Aristotle, but when we come to Ibn Sina, in his metaphysics, or what he calls the ilahiyat of the Shifa, he's looking at the question of being or existence, wujud. And you find the same thing in Mullah Sadra. So this is a concern of Islamic philosophy and theology. And when I was in Egypt, I read Sunni Kalam there. I just was not impressed at all, to be very frank. So there was a book that was on the reading list there called Jawharatut Tawheed. And I remember, so this is an Ash'ari text. And I remember my teacher, Shaykh Hassan Salim, rahimahullah, asked him, he said, no, you see, al-wujud aynul mawjud. And I thought to myself, no, it's not. It's not. It's different. And so I never really saw, at least in those kind of Sunni texts, but there are of course later ones, but those later ones are influenced by the Tajrīd. Yeah. And so I had encountered these kind of books early on. Then when I went and read Sunni Kalam, especially that kind of Sunni Kalam, I found it to be quite problematic. And it's a strange quirk of destiny, but there was a journal that came out in the early days of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, in English, called Tawheed.
Tawheed, yeah. Ali Quli Qarai was the editor.
Ali Quli Qarai.
Yeah.
And I was always looking for copies of that. This is before the internet. And so even when I was at Purdue University, I had like 3 issues. And anyway, I don't know where I got them from, but somehow I got them, right? And there was an article in there about Mullah Sadra and about Sabzawari. This is where I first heard these names, Mullah Hadi Sabzawari. And there were a few lines there from the Manzuma or the Ghurar al-Fara'id, which is the correct name of the book. And they really made a deep impression on me. And I still remember them to this day. But later on, I went and started studying the book when I finally found a copy in the Princeton University Library, the old lithograph, Chope Sangi. And he says, مُعَرِّفُ الْوُجُودِ شَرْحُ الْإِسْمِ right? مُعَرِّفُ الْوُجُودِ شَرْحُ الْإِسْمِ وَلَيْسَ بِالْحَدِّ وَلَا بِالرَّسْمِ مَفْهُومُهُ مِنْ عَرْفِ الْأَشْيَاءِ وَكُنْهُهُ فِي غَايَةِ الْخَفَاءِ. And so this made a really deep impression on me, that all defining terms of existence are but nominal designations or explications of the mere word or the name. And that it can neither have a definition, a had or a rasam or a description. And that it is the most well-known of things, intuitively speaking, but that its kun, or that its ultimate reality, lies in the extremity of hiddenness. Yeah. So that idea and that thought very much stuck with me. And then when I went to Princeton, because it has such a fantastic library, I was able to go and read and look in these different sort of kalam texts over the centuries. And I remember having an office hour. I went and visited Professor Mudarrisi during his office hours and asked him about all of the important Shia kalam texts. And he gave me a list, and I went and started looking for them. And so that's how I encountered Tajrid al-Iʿtiqād. Okay. And I found it to be an extremely difficult book.
Well,
and of course I had it with I had, there were commentaries, but oddly enough, the first sharh which I found, I don't know if the book was checked out, but when I went to look for the book in Firestone, that's the library of Princeton. Okay. I couldn't find on the shelf the Kashf al-Murad of al-Allama al-Hilli. Maybe someone had taken it or had checked it out, and I found the sharh by Agha Zanjani. And it wasn't really a great edition, but that's the first time I encountered it. And so then when you read that, later I found the sharh, of course, of Kashf al-Murad by al-Allama al-Hilli. Then you see that this is pre-Mullah Sadra, this is pre-al-Hikmat al-Muta'aliya. And it's really a distillation. The first 2 maqsads really are a distillation of Avicennian metaphysics. And that's where I first encountered Nasiruddin al-Tusi as a theologian. I had heard of him before because, I was like I said, I would read lots of things. And I knew about Nasiruddin al-Tusi, but I knew of him more as an astronomer, as a mathematician, and the author of the Akhlaq al-Nasiri. And being a bibliophile and collecting books, when I would go back to the city of my birth, Lucknow, I was collecting as many books as I could find from the Munshi Naval Kishore Press. And one of the famous books that was published there were the 3 famous works on Akhlaq in Persian, which used to be part of the Munshi Fazal examination. Akhlaq Nasiri by Nasiruddin Tusi, Akhlaq Jalali by, I think it's Jalaluddin Davani, and Akhlaq Muhsinin. I had them all. Mm-hmm. Beautiful lithographs. And so that's what I really knew about Nasiruddin. I didn't really know much about this other aspect of him. And I knew, of course, that he was the commentator on the Isharat, al-Isharat wa Tanbihat, which I had an edition which I had purchased in Cairo. So that's how I first encountered Nasiruddin. But I didn't really start studying him carefully until I got to Cairo. And after I came back, before I went to Cairo, I have to say. Before I went to Cairo, there was a friend of mine, Sayyid Sibtain Abdi, he lives in New Jersey here, and he had told me about, again, this is the very early days of the internet. And he said, there's some really good lectures on Tajrid al-Iʿtiqād. You can go online and download them. And I said, by who? I don't know. He said, there's some guy named Kamal Haidari. Oh, okay. So I remember I downloaded a bunch of lectures of Sayyid Kamal al-Haidari, the young Sayyid Kamal. Yes. And I listened to some of his lectures on the Tajrīd. And then, anyway, I had other things to do. And then when I got to Egypt, and while I was in the middle of working on the Fusus al-Hikam, I started reading the Tajrid al-Iʿtiqād carefully. And then I realized that most people today, and maybe you can shed light on this, in the Hawza, maybe not in your day, but it seems now, they drop the first two sections and they go straight to al-ilahiyat bil-ma'na al-khas. And I found that very unfortunate. And anyway, so I started reading it with the Sharh in Cairo, and I was really struggling with it. It's not an easy book. And I had it with the ta'liqat of Hassan Zadeh Amri, but I sort of plowed through it. And then I came back to the United States in 2015 for many reasons. And I think around 2016, 2017, around that time, I returned to the Tajrīd. And there was this project to translate it. And so that's how I started. Okay. But in the course of translating the matan, as you know, is very concentrated, it's very concise, and there's really no way you can understand it without the commentary. And if Al-Allama al-Hilli had not written the Sharh, I don't think anyone would understand the book. So to do my translation and to understand it, I read every single word, every single footnote by Agha Hassan Zadeh Marhum as well, all 600 pages. And I have my own notes and highlighting, and it took me a long time. And in the process of reading through it, a lot of issues come up because he talks about lots of things. And so the question about metaphysics and so forth is very much indebted to Aristotle, but then he has a section on the soul as well. It's very brief. That's also Aristotle. So I went and looked all these things up in Western philosophy in Aristotle. Aristotle is also not an easy read. So I referred to commentaries by Thomas Aquinas. And so I read very widely to try and understand this book.
The text, Well, it's considered to be, even now, I think, the most advanced text in Shia theology.
Indeed.
And I know from the some of the verbal statements my late father, Marhum Allama Sayyid Rizvi, had left regarding his own biography.
Right.
That this was one of the most advanced texts taught in the seminaries in India during his time. But I wasn't able to see whether it was the entire text or only Ilahiyat bil Ma'na al-Akhas.
Right.
The last part. During my time, 70s and early 80s in Qom, even in Najaf, I think, it is still considered to be one of the most advanced texts, but unfortunately it's not one of the textbooks which are kind of mandatory. These are all optional. If you have an interest in it, then you go into it and find a teacher. And yes, there are always some very good teachers where you can go and study these books, because if you look at some of the books which are coming in new textbooks, especially in Qom, they are replacing all these classical texts, which is in a way natural with the development. But I think familiarity with classical work is very important. For especially Hawzawi seminary students. So books like Bidayat al-Hikmah of Allama Tabatabai and Nihayat al-Hikmah are gradually taking their place. And so I don't think even in Qom it is being taught completely. No. As far as I know, even in Najaf, these are all the focus more is, the core curriculum is based on usul and fiqh. Usul al-fiqh and fiqh. All other things are side, interest that you have, whether it's tafsir or tariq or ilm kalam in that way, or falsafa. Of course, the Qom school is more inclined towards falsafa. And Najaf still
not so much.
Yes, I remember in one of the visits just a few years ago, I saw an alim in Najaf, a young scholar, who had spent a few years here in Canada also, from an Iraqi background. He came to see me in the hotel lobby there in Najaf.
Right.
And he had a book with him where there was a brown cover on it.
Yeah.
So I said, what is this? I was curious to see, why the title page has been covered. He says, this is Bidayatul Hikmah. I said, the cover? He said, it's not, they don't look at it positively.
Yeah.
We study, and he says, yes, we have teachers who teach that, but they consider it to be less important. So unfortunately,
what year was this, if I may ask?
This is about, I think, 5 years ago.
Wow, that recent.
Yeah. So it is being taught. It's not that the tradition of philosophy in that way is not there in Najaf. You have people in all generations who have been very important. You have even people like Sayyid Baqir al-Sadr, who was in this field, although his teacher, Marhum Ayatollah Khoyi, was not very much into it.
Right.
He has a remark in his Taqrirat on this issue. There's a whole discussion in Kitab al-Tahara about najis elements. When they talk about kafir and other definitions, there the issue is of those who believe in wahdat al-wujud. What is their status?
Yeah.
Sayyid Yazdi in Al-Urwa al-Wusqa discusses that, and that was the matan used by Ayatollah Khoyi for his fiqhi ijtihadi. Yeah. And there, of course, they say it doesn't mean that anybody who believes in wahdat al-wujud is a kafir or najis and this and that. They only qualify it if it's in the meaning of wahdat al-wujud as Sufi. Sufiya in that sense, that wahdat al-wujud wal-mujud, that becomes a problematic issue. Otherwise, it's fine. So Ayatollah Khoyi has a remark there. He says, I haven't yet understood what does this mean, wahdat al-wujud. I wish somebody can explain it to me. So, the tradition of, I would say, ta'aqqul in ilm kalam has been always there. But, going strictly into that path of philosophy, no. Qom probably is more friendly environment for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, about ta'aqqul, so those two maqsads of the two openings were of the two initial sections of the Tajrīd. They're kind of a summation of the philosophy of Ibn Sina. And Marhum Ayatollah Hassan Zadi's ta'liqat or glosses are really useful in this regard, because in many, not every, but in many instances, he references passages of the commentary of Nasiruddin al-Tusi on the Isharat, the remarks and admonitions of Ibn Sina. And of course, with the passage of time, the school of Mullah Sadra is not the school of Ibn Sina. So maybe this is one reason. They're sort of pushing that in Qom, I suppose, with Bidayatul Hikmah and so forth. But the fact is, you can't really understand the philosophy of al-Hikmat al-Muta'ali, or the school of Mullah Sadra, unless you have a good grounding in Avicenna or Ibn Sina. And I really think you can't really understand Ibn Sina very well unless you have taken some time to read some Aristotle. But anyway, having said all of that, the place of aql, or the use of the intelligence or the intellect, is extremely, of course, important, as you pointed. And it's very much part of not just Shi'i theology, but Shi'i law. And that's a distinguishing feature from, let's say, the Ash'ari school. And even in law, there's this principle, although it's not really, you can shed light on this maybe, but the qa'idatul mulazama, that kullama hakama bihi al-aql hakama bihi al-shara. Whatever is legislated by intellect or understood that way by intellect is also confirmed or legislated by Sharia. And in the context of a theological question which directly impinges on usul al-fiqh, and which is distinguished in this Shi'i school, is al-husn al-qub al-aqliyan.
Yes.
The idea of the rationality of the ethical valuation of acts, that there is a rational basis for something being deemed good or evil. And you don't have that in the Ash'ari school.
Yes.
That's al-husn wal-qub al-shar'iyyan. So it's whatever is legislated is good, and whatever is legislated as such is bad. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said on the Ash'ari view that alcohol is licit and orange juice is haram, then that's what it would have been.
Yeah, or lying is okay.
For example.
That would be, yeah.
Yeah. So there's all these sorts of discussions, and I think that really distinguishes the Shi'i 12er school. And that's very much there in Nasiruddin al-Tusi.
Yeah.
But at the same time, and I think this is important, Nasiruddin al-Tusi is also a kind of a Sufi in certain respects. I mean, he has a book, whether it's from his so-called Ismaili episode or not is another matter. That's another whole topic of discussion. For the record, I think that was just something he was doing. I think he was a very complicated individual. And I think that in the time that he lived, the Ismaili fortress where he spent many years, that was just very convenient for him. You know, I mean, it's like now, people need a job. People need and if you have a library and a stipend and you can work there, then fine. And if the Ismailis are providing it. So I don't really think he ever was Ismaili. I think he was 12er. But anyhow, he has a book called Awsaf al-Ashraf, supposedly in the Ismaili period. And he has texts like this. And he had an extended correspondence. Now, the nature of that correspondence is debated. You know, what exactly are they saying to each other? But he had an extended correspondence with none other than Sadruddin Qunawi, the disciple and stepson of Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi. And it is published and it has been studied. And they're discussing these issues. And, you know, some people interpret that, you know, Sadruddin Qunawi is sort of indicating to him that the ultimate truth is beyond philosophy, or that philosophy doesn't really get you there and what you really need is kashf. But I don't think that Nasiruddin or any of these Islamic philosophers, including Ibn Sina, would have denied the possibility of a kind of experiential, if you like, I don't really use the term mysticism. I think the word in English and the English term mysticism often also implies a certain kind of irrationality and emotionalism, especially when it's used in a Christian context. So I try and avoid it. But anyway, mysticism, if you like, quote unquote, as a path, or irfan or tasawwuf, I don't think they would have rejected that. And that is also an element, at least, of some currents in the Shi'i tradition, but particularly the kind of people who would read philosophy. I think a lot of people who in the Shia tradition who are involved in falsafa are also, it's falsafa / irfan, and a lot of the big names, right? Like Allama Tabatabai, like Sayyid Khomeini, they were involved in philosophy, but they were also involved in sort of practical mysticism, what I think they tend to call in Iran irfan amali.
Amali, yeah.
So I think there's an important sort of convergence, at least in some individuals and for some adherents of the 12er school, of all of these things.
But that path would not be something open for everyone.
No, it's not.
And that's where we end up more in this intellectual basis of our faith, especially this is where Tajrīd al-Iʿtiqād comes in to place. It's interesting to see that if it wasn't for Allama Hilli, this book would have been difficult to understand at all.
To put it mildly.
But it is an important text in the sense that Sheikh Abul Hasan Sha'rani, the Farsi translator and commentator of Shari Tajrīd, in his Muqaddamah uses the term, he says, you know, for those who are into seminary and religious studies, it is wajib a'ayni to study Tajrīd al-Iʿtiqād.
Interesting.
Shari Tajrīd.
Very interesting, yeah.
He uses this term wajib a'ayni for them.
It makes sense. I mean, it's rational theology.
Yeah.
He argues, you know, on rational basis. So.
But it was interesting for me to connect that with Allama Hilli, who wrote this commentary on Tajrīd. He also later on, when he, in a way, summarized Sheikh Tusi's Minhaj al-Salah. That's the summary of Misbah al-Mutahajjid of Sheikh Tusi.
Yes.
In 10 chapters. It is a book of dua.
Yes, it is.
And then, but he realizes for the da'i, it's important to know whom he's talking to. And that's why he has this al-Bab al-Hadi Ashar.
Right.
Ends up writing this section on Aqidah.
Right.
Which is on the same, method of rational arguments. But this is much in a lower level, I would say, compared to Tajrid al-Iʿtiqād or Sharh Tajrīd, which was much advanced. And that book is still considered to be one of the textbooks used in the seminary even now, as a beginning.
Yes.
Before Sharh Tajrīd.
Tajrīd, yeah.
And I remember reading somewhere that even Dr. Mehdi Muhaqqiq used to teach this in postgraduate classes in University of Tehran.
Yeah.
And also to the students when he was in McGill in Montreal.
A long time ago, yeah.
Yeah,
60s,
yeah.
Yeah.
Using the translation of William Miller, which was published in 1928. I've gone through it also because in the series of classes that I had on theology here on a weekly basis. I think even that's a text which needs to be translated again.
Okay.
Something
in the future, yeah.
Yeah, because he's done a good job, William Miller, but he was essentially a missionary living in Mashhad.
Yeah.
And so when I look at these two works, in a way they are connected to one another. And it's interesting that this idea of, having the book of dua, but then at the end you have a section on Iʿtiqādat, where, later on Father al-Miqdad comes and writes a commentary on that. This method I also have seen in the contemporary scholars. Shaykh Baqir al-Sadr, when he wrote his Risala, al-Fatawa al-Wadiha, the introduction of that is on Iʿtiqādat, which was separated, which is also published now separately. I think Dr. Mahmoud Ayyub did the translation of that, which is again based on that rational argument, going through this whole issue of wajib al-wujud and mumkin al-wujud, going back to Ibn Sina's
necessity and contingency.
Yeah. And even interestingly, I saw Ayatollah Wahid Khurasani in his Tawzih al-Masail begins with a very extensive introduction on Usul al-Din before going to the Masail. And so basically this is a very interesting theme that we see they're developing in different ways. But all based on that ta'aqqul or rational method of understanding theology. But let me just I think towards the end, the role of Tajrīd and the interest of Sunni theologians in writing these commentaries on it. Sharh Qadim and Sharh Jadid, it's all by Sunni scholars. It's interesting for me to see that in the present environment of this Wahhabi, propaganda against the Shias and takfiri fatwas coming against the Shias, this was a time where even a Sunni theologian will take the text from a Shia and write a commentary on it. Which I don't see happening during our times.
That's a very interesting aspect of the history and transmission of the Tajrid al-Iʿtiqād.
Yeah.
So there are something like 200 commentaries over the centuries that have been produced on the Tajrid al-Iʿtiqād, and the truly astonishing fact is that of these, most of them are by Sunnis.
Yeah.
Now, is it that the Sunnis loved this
That's
book that much? Well, it depends. I mean, it depends on who you read. And so you're quite right. You know, the Sharh of al-Isfahani, which is called the Sharh al-Qadim, Tasdeed al-Qawa'id. This was, let's just get the dates right. Isfahani died in 749 of the Hijrah.
Yeah.
That's a very important Sharh, but it's a Sunni Sharh. Right? And you have to remember Nasiruddin died in 672 of the Hijrah. So he writes this commentary, and it is a very large commentary. And I want to say that when I was doing my translation, I would sometimes refer to it to see what he said, especially in the first two sections. Mm. So I think that there was an interest on the part of Sunni scholars in Ibn Sina. And again, those first two, really the first two maqsads is about 2/3 of the book. In the sense that, 2/3 of the Kashf al-Murad is about that much. And so the better part of the text is devoted to summarizing the philosophy of Ibn Sina. And that was something which everyone was interested in. I mean, even Maimonides, he's a Jewish rabbi, but he is interested in the philosophy of Ibn Sina, right? So that's one motivation. But I think that this is really the elephant in the room. The section on imama is absolutely devastating. Now, Nasiruddin al-Tusi doesn't go into detail because he's, again, writing a matn. And then even when al-Allama al-Hilli in Kashf al-Murad, he doesn't go into detail about the hadiths and historical references. He assumes that the readership, his learned readership, would be able to track those things down. But Khaja Nasir mentions a lot of historical facts and cites a number of hadiths, but he doesn't mention them explicitly. And those represent a serious challenge to the Sunni narrative. And so I am of the view that the Sunni commentators, one reason they took an interest in this book is they had to say something. Okay. So they thought, well, let's just comment on the whole book. And if you actually look at the Imama sections, they are, by these Sunni scholars and the comments they make there, they are, well, let's just say they're amusing. And so that's this is called the Sharh al-Qadim, and then there's another very important Sharh which comes later, which is called the Sharh al-Jadid, which is by al-Qawshaji. Qawshaji dies 879, 1474. Those still remain the most sort of substantial commentaries on the work. And indeed, there is a new edition of the Tasdeed al-Qawaid or Sharh al-Qadim, which was published in Istanbul, beautiful, and in 3 volumes. And volume 1 is actually just introductions about all the different manuscripts and things like this. So that is one aspect. But another influence, another effect of the writing of this book, the Tajrid al-Iʿtiqād and commentaries on it, is that a different sort of Sunni kalam, I think, emerges in reaction. And that is, so there's a Sunni kalam work, and this is a heavy one, with this whole discussion of wujud and al-mahiyya, quiddity and existence and all these sorts of very difficult sort of Abyssinian topics. And that's the Kitab al-Mawaqif of Adududdin al-Iji. Very hard to pronounce this name. Ain Dad Dal, Adududdin al-Iji. And he has the Kitab al-Mawaqif. He dies, it's either 753 or 756. There seems to be a difference of opinion on his death date from what I read. But that becomes an extremely important work of Sunni kalam, explicitly Sunni kalam, and there's many commentaries on that. But if you look at it, it's organized like the Tajrid. Okay. It's organized like the Tajrid, and it also ends with the whole discussion of imama, of course, the Sunni version, Adalat al-Sahaba, and all of this. And another really important book is by al-Qadi al-Baydawi, who, of course, is the author of the famous, what's known as the Tafsir al-Baydawi or Tafsir al-Baydawi. So he has a Matal al-Anwar. He has his own matan, but it's also structured very much like the Tajrid al-I'tiqad. There's also the Maqasid, as another Sunni kalam work, again, I think under the influence of the Tajrid.
Tajrid, okay.
Now, in terms of the modern day climate, though,
Yeah.
there has been an interesting turn of events, which I would like to just say a few words on.
Okay.
So there is a Sunni Muslim scholar. He's an white American convert by the name of Hamza Yusuf.
Yes.
And this gentleman established a college called the Zaytuna College, which is a great idea, which is a good idea. And he is a kind of Sufi, but also a kind of Ash'ari, and he's a very well-known figure. People who live in America and North America know this. So back in Ramzan of this year, Ramadan, I was sitting in my tiny apartment in Miami, and I was on YouTube, and I saw that he gave a lecture at Harvard University on the liberal arts. Now, what I found truly astonishing was when he gave this lecture, he's talking about the liberal arts in the Muslim tradition and the sort of broad understanding of knowledge and classification of knowledge in the Muslim tradition. And who does he quote? He puts up on a PowerPoint slide, but in Arabic. Nasiruddin al-Tusi, he's quoting from the Akhlaq al-Nasiri.
Oh, okay.
There was an Arabic translation, I forget who did it, it's published by Brill. And so he took that and he's quoting from Nasiruddin al-Tusi. And he admits that he's a Shia scholar. And he, later I found out that he is very interested in introducing the Tajrid al-Iʿtiqād.
Yeah.
Yes, the Tajrid al-Iʿtiqād as a text
for
their graduate students. This is what I've heard.
Yeah, that's I've been told.
That would be interesting if that happens. So maybe now history is repeating itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think our time is running out. Maybe I wanted to just commend you for the translation. I haven't finished reading it, the manuscript that you sent, but your introduction is very interesting, especially your entry to the introduction. About this minor planet being named the Tusi.
Yeah, they named it after it's an asteroid or minor planet.
Yeah, and even the crater in Moon named after him during our time, and this was really recognition of his contribution to astronomy. But especially your discussion in the introduction about poverty of postmodernism, limitations of scientism.
Yeah, the poverty of postmodernism.
And new atheism. These are very relevant to the challenges that young people in our communities face now. And so I hope this work comes out soon.
Inshallah.
And this is something for you to think that maybe the introduction by itself can come out later on as a booklet, because not everybody is going to read the translation of Tajrid. But the introduction, I think, is worth being published separately later on.
Perhaps,
for the learned young generation of our community.
Well, I mean, if I could say just a couple of, I really think that Nasiruddin al-Tusi deserves to be more widely known. I think he is one of the great intellects, not just in our tradition, Shia tradition, or in the general Islamic tradition, but in intellectual history of the human race. He has tremendous contributions, even in mathematics. People who know about mathematics, and this is high school math now, but trigonometry as we know it today, he wrote the first dedicated textbook to trigonometry, both plane trigonometry and spherical trigonometry in history. And the trigonometric functions of sine, cosine, tangent, cosecant, cotangent, and secant as we know them today, he really developed that. He's the one who did that. That's just one of the things he did. He also has a work on prosody, ilm al-arud.
Okay, yeah.
And he really took part in all. He took part seriously in all of the sciences of his day. He's really a hazar fan. He's a person who's a Renaissance man, as we would say in English, or a hazar fan meaning he's a multifaceted genius in 1,000 fields. and he really deserves to be better known. And what I really think we need is a commentary on the Tajrīd in English.
In English, yeah.
And that's something maybe I would like to work on in the future, inshallah.
Inshallah. Well, I would like to thank you for the time.
It was a pleasure.
And,
thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
I hope the viewers are going to benefit from this and the other podcasts that we have in the Shia Research Institute. Inshallah, you can go to the website to see the other discussions in the past and keep in touch for the future ones. And of course, this kind of work, as far as the activities of Shia Research Institute is concerned, cannot happen without your support. So your donations are welcome on the website. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam.